good.
Okay. G'day guys, you are here with Jacob Schepis from JPS on episode 3 of the JPS podcast series. And today we have a very special guest, Mr. Ian McCarthy. And Ian is the owner of Lifting for Life and No Bullshit Bodybuilding, and is one of the great young minds in the fitness industry. In essence, Ian has led the push for evidence-based bodybuilding practices within the broader bodybuilding and lifting community, and made a name for himself as the institutional hater for misinformation and pseudoscience. Isn't that right, Ian?
I'll take it.
You'll take it? And he's known for his critical thinking ability, online debating prowess, as well as his innate talent to piss others off, especially Lyle McDonald. So welcome, Ian.
Glad to be here. I appreciate the very welcoming introduction.
I thought you might. I put a bit of effort into that one. So, Ian, today I wanted to talk to you about a number of things, critical thinking more specifically, and then as that relates to bodybuilding, training, nutrition, and how we take literature and evidence, critically evaluate that and apply it in a practical sense, which is something I think you've done extremely well throughout your short career in the industry. And one of the first questions I wanted to ask you, Ian, which is the same question that you asked Eric in your recent interview, was what is your internal dialogue? What goes through the mind of Ian Brown McCarthy?
Well, I think it's a really interesting question, and I've been thinking about this a lot recently. Can you even really teach critical thinking? And I think to a large extent, it's either there or not. And as funny as this might sound, from a very, very early age, my default was really to say no and to disagree with the predominant opinion. And I don't think that was trained, that was just present. And that, by the way, can be very problematic, because if there are things that you need to do and you simply don't want to do them, if you actually do need to do that which some authority figure wants you to do, etc. So people like me get in trouble in school and so on.
For sure.
But again, I don't think that I did something to get that. I think I've been able to refine it through practice and through making mistakes. I think in wanting to, frame this in a way that it might actually benefit someone listening to this, I think what it really comes down to is not taking everything at face value and instead considering it and trying to find holes in it. Indeed, even what I'm saying right now, I would encourage people not to simply say, okay, Ian is this guy who has this reputation as being a debater and thinking critically, so I'll just take this as this is the advice. Rather, take it and try it, see if it works for you, see if it holds up, and maybe it doesn't. And again, I would apply that here and into everything. So, again, I think that's about the extent to which one can, I think that's the best general suggestion as to what you do in practice. I'd be glad to get more in depth to specific cases.
Yeah, we'll definitely get into that. So something that Eric mentioned to me when I interviewed him a few days back was he truly believes that people can change. And relating that to what you said in terms of you either do have the ability to critically think or not, let's take, for instance, that people can't change and people can't learn how to critically think. We know that we don't want to be somebody's guru and have them just take what we say, as face value, and we want them to think about it and, critically evaluate it. But in the instance that somebody can't critically think, are they better off taking our advice and just following suit as opposed to taking somebody else's advice who doesn't critically evaluate the literature and so forth?
Right. So I'm not sure I would want to go as far as to say that, and by the way, this isn't a criticism of you, but just the idea that some people can't critically think. Rather, I wanted to speak to the fact that I think it's largely inborn. It's something I think a lot about. Everyone grants that something like height is heavily influenced by genetics.
Yeah.
Intelligence would probably be similar. Maybe, less people would agree with that, but I think that's there as well. And even things like personality traits and how you approach the way that you think about what other people say. But again, I'm not sure I would want to say that some people can't critically think. Rather, some people's default is to believe that other people are telling the truth.
Mm.
If someone says something, it's just true. And what's interesting is that can yield a really pleasant and kind person.
Mm.
But oftentimes, those are the people who, to be blunt, and I'm not sure if you allow profanity, but those people can get fucked.
Yeah.
Those are the people who, if they just see someone who's attractive and charming and who's selling them something for $700 that does absolutely nothing, they might fall for that as a function of they don't think people are dishonest.
Yeah.
They don't think people are out to get them and so on. So So again, I'm not sure I would say people can't critically think. Rather, I think we have different starting points.
Ability on a broad spectrum. Yeah.
Right. So for some people, it's more or less there, and for other people, they will have to really practice it. And maybe what that means is they'll be disappointed. They will really look up to someone, and they'll make certain claims, and then they actually find out down the road that they're incorrect, and that will be the lesson which teaches them, I need to be more questioning than I've been. I'm not sure I recall what the question was, to be honest. Should those people just find someone who seems trustworthy and more or less listen to them? Is that I think there's a gray area here. Something I've said in the past is, don't assume that something is true because Eric Helms says it, because Eric and Alan Aragon and James Krieger and Brad Schoenfeld, they all say it. And one of the objections which has been brought up to me, which I think is a very reasonable objection, is, well, if they all agree, really what is the likelihood that it isn't true? And again, I appreciate that, and I would say it's unlikely. So I do think that in practice, look, if there's someone out there who fitness is not their life, rather they work a 9-to-5, they're married, they have 3 children, they train 3-4 days a week, their workouts are an hour long, they want to make progress, but it's basically they want to be healthy, they don't want to look fat. It might be as simple as that. Then yes, I think in practice it's probably reasonable for that person to more or less pay attention to folks like Eric, Greg Knuckles, etc., and apply toward that the time and energy they can in terms of thinking about it critically. But there comes a point where you just can't expect everyone to read 2 full texts a day. That might literally mean that's the time that they're not spending cooking dinner for their kids. What are you talking about? So yes, I do try to be pragmatic and recognize that not all people, again, fitness isn't everyone's life. It's not the primary thing that they're focused on. So I wouldn't expect every person to live the life of a researcher.
Yeah, for sure. And, you strike me as one of few people in our industry who actually do, think a lot about what is being said and the different ideas, topics and opinions, and you break them down quite well and come to your own informed conclusions as to what you think and believe and do and do not do. But a lot of people simply regurgitate information from their gurus, right?
Right.
And did you find that it was your background in debating that helped you do this?
Well, I would first say, for the sake of transparency, that this is something that I have done in the past. No question. There are things where I'm able to see in hindsight that essentially what I was doing was regurgitating from different people. It kind of depends on when we're thinking. And I would note that I'm definitely seeing this. As an example, and I'll speak very frankly, and this is no critique of Mike Israetel, but I have perceived, I've noticed what I perceive as pretty hardcore regurgitation of his MRV concept. And again, that's not a criticism of him. I think it's a good concept. I think it's useful. I don't think it's, Mike Israetel made up colon cleansing or something. But I do see people using almost exact phrases that he uses, but they're not quoting him. It just really strikes me as a regurgitation. it's just they've read this and then they say almost exactly the same thing. And that, again, that's concerning to me, and I've seen that in other contexts as well. Again, I find myself not remembering the question. I'm sorry. I have very severe ADD, so it's not my fault.
The question was, did your debating help you critically evaluate ideas, concepts, and topics? Was that something that you found useful in terms of critically thinking?
Again, I think I would return to, it's largely been there with regard to, there is this meme I've noticed online of Ian has this background in debating. I don't have any debate training. I didn't do it in school or anything like this. Rather, I do think it was the natural result of defaulting typically to disagreeing. And I've always surrounded myself, not by construct, just it happens naturally, with people who often disagree with me. So I think that's always been true. I've always had close friends who are very willing to disagree with me and I with them, and we're able to maintain mutual respect, which is very important, because for a lot of people it just doesn't work. It gets too personal. And again, there's definitely an aspect of practice to that as well.
Yeah.
I think probably the two things I have most improved have been my ability to be objective and also my ability to be more respectful in debate, because I have realized that indeed I didn't read the study, but I was reading an article about a study last night talking about how in one particular study it was demonstrated that radical agreement was the most effective means of changing the minds of others. In other words, more or less agreeing with everything they're saying. In that, we understand that there's a psychological response of if you attack someone's views, that can be perceived as an attack on them, and it results in someone's existing viewpoint becoming increasingly ingrained. Yeah. So it is very important to me at this point that, for example, if you were to say to me, and I mean, who knows, maybe you would, that you think training each body part once a week is the way to go. One option would be to say, well, you're a fucking moron. Like, do you even read literature, bro? and now, you might be extremely mature and be able to take that and there wouldn't be an issue. But I think a better option would be, that's really interesting. Let's have a discussion about that. You seem a reasonable guy. I don't think you just got there arbitrarily. I'm curious to know what your reasons are. And that's almost universally way more productive. And the result is that if one person or the other is wrong, the person who is wrong is typically more able to acknowledge that. Yeah. And if there's just disagreement that's not going to go away, at the very least you're able to flesh that out and explore it.
That was one of my questions later on, but seeing as though it seems very fitting to ask you this question now, have you matured since you first got into the industry?
No, definitely not. No, yes, I think so. I think
that your response and the last 2 minutes of conversation highlights to me that you have significantly.
Right, definitely. Like the way I put it to folks in person when it comes up, and this is a very laughably what would be the word I would use here, but I honestly think it has a lot to do with the degree of development of the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in impulse control. Like, I honestly think this is a big deal. That's not a process, to my knowledge, that's a process which isn't complete until the late 20s in males, and I think that's probably a bit, it's funny, I can't take credit for that. I think because a lot of I think the way I think on a very visceral level, the totally unfiltered thoughts that you just have, like whether it's you see something on social media or someone does something stupid on television or whatever it is. I mean, that's largely the same, and I'm better able now to recognize that just blurting out everything is not the way to go in life.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and again, wanting to... recognizing that the objective isn't identify the bro science and destroy the bro science.
Yeah.
I made a post about this on a status on Facebook about this recently, talking about how, producing content with the objective being helping people, I believe, to be more honorable than, again, identifying the misinformation and blowing it up. Because the way some people operate, I genuinely wonder, and hey, again, to be transparent, I think that this thought could be directed toward what I was doing 5 or 6 years ago. I wonder if they actually even care about, really care about improving other people's lives, or if it's like a gigantic ego trip
for sure.
of, this, that, and the other person who's promoting this view, which is actually incorrect. They're a fucking moron. Yes, science. And I would grant that if you are technically correct, that's of significance. Like, if someone is extremely nice and wrong about everything, there's a problem. But similarly, if someone is usually technically correct, but just very explosive and disrespectful in their general approach to discourse, then that's also profoundly problematic, in my opinion.
For sure. And something I've been wanting to ask you, Ian, was, how did you fall into the fitness industry? Because you're quite an interesting case. Most people who get to the stature that, you have, and to be in a position of, I guess, authority as you and, Lifting for Life are, typically go through, a certain discourse of, like coaching. They've either competed as a natural bodybuilder, powerlifter, achieved a number of milestones and, accomplishments. And then it's like, okay, 10 years in the trenches and coaching and whatnot, we'll start listening to you. You bypassed a lot of that, to a large degree. How did you go about that?
Well, so to go all the way back, I originally got into...
How the hell did you do it, Ian?
Yeah, well, so to be very direct, it was a lot to do with just the drama initially. Numerous people have said, numerous people have said things like they only even got into evidence-based fitness at all. They didn't even know of the concept prior to the video I made about the Hodge twins.
Yeah.
It's a bit hard to process because that's not something that I would do now. But from a very consequentialist kind of perspective of, ends justify the means, like if you benefited thousands of people, then it kind of doesn't matter. Then one might say it was worth it. But I think that was it. I think it was a lot of that throughout, really kind of from the beginning. I originally created my YouTube channel because I didn't know of YouTube fitness. I stumbled upon it. I saw people putting out content, which was, in my mind, very clearly really bad. Not just, I disagree with them somewhat, because, look, I can't think of examples off the top of my head, but I know that Eric, as someone who I think is one of the very best in the industry, has said things with which I disagree. That's not what I mean. I mean just really bad content. And I saw this and I was like, okay, if people are putting this kind of thing out and they're successful, then I did give it a shot,
Yeah.
Yeah, so again, from the beginning, it was a response to my perception of really bad recommendations being put out, and that was right from 2011, and then things really blew up in 2012, 2013. And interestingly, that correlated really strongly with the rise of YouTube fitness generally.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to see how 2009, 2010, 2011-ish, no one that I know of was talking about flexible dieting, at least on YouTube, other than maybe 3DMJ. And I don't want to take credit away from them. Like, if you go back to really old videos on the 3DMJ channel, they were probably talking about flexible dieting back then.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they had a much smaller platform than they do now. And then I think the stuff I put out was, I think it would have happened anyway, but it was probably the trigger for that huge shift in views toward flexible dieting happening then. And we've now gotten to the point where, and I realize this is far away from your question, but
No, it's good.
where flexible dieting is almost a cliche. It's almost like one of the things we assume and don't talk about. So yeah, again, the approach that I used then is not one that I would use now, but it resulted in that exposure. And then I do think that over the past 2 years or so, in taking a very different approach, I've developed a reputation I didn't have. So I have had people say, I saw your stuff then, I hated you, and then I didn't pay attention. And then I came back 2 or 3 years later, and then I saw a different person, and I like you now.
Yeah, for sure. And do you have any formal qualifications?
No.
No, yeah. And do you see the value in fitness qualifications, or do you see no value in it?
I think it's very context dependent. I endeavor to take a very neutral and objective perspective on this. It's really like you've probably practically anyone who is any kind of fitness professional who has access to the internet and sees what's happening on social media probably sees the rise of the school is a scam, etc. perspective.
Yeah.
And so that's one perspective, and then there's also the perspective of qualifications are extremely important. Scientific elitism is a phrase which comes to mind with me frequently of people who, like, if someone doesn't have a scientific degree, they essentially don't matter to them. So I think that let's say someone has a PhD in something relating to fitness. If absolutely nothing else, it does tell you that that person spent a huge amount of time studying that subject and put in a lot of work and did original research. I mean, we know the minimum, the least that one has to do to achieve that. It's not nothing.
Yeah.
So when I see people, and I see people frequently saying, degree's just a piece of paper, it doesn't mean anything, I don't know how one can say that. I really don't know how one can say that. At the same time, I wouldn't say that if someone has a PhD or if someone has a master's or whatever it might be, that necessarily means that they're extremely intelligent, knowledgeable, objective, etc. And so unfortunately, we simultaneously have the problem of people who have no qualifications, and on top of not having qualifications, they're not intelligent and they're not very knowledgeable. And they're putting out content, and they might have reach as a function of getting on a platform early, or the way they look, or something like this. They might be putting out misinformation. And we simultaneously have the issue of people who have qualifications but are putting out misinformation. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Again, I endeavor to approach it not from the perspective of,
yeah,
I don't have qualifications, so, they all gotta suck.
Yeah.
And similarly, I do think they can tell you a lot about a person, and I do think all else being equal, if someone has a degree versus not, it would be reasonable to take that person's advice more seriously. But
do you endeavor to get any qualifications?
I think I will. I feel that it's something I need to do. That I would be, really leaving something on the table if I were to not do it.
Yeah.
Interestingly, though, I'm not sure if 5 years ago I would think that that it's possible to learn as much as I have in the absence of getting a degree.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really, we are tremendously fortunate as a function of really the internet. I mean, the fact that the amount of information just freely available. People will ask me, where do you find stuff? Just go,
Google
and I don't mean this to be condescending, by the way. I don't expect everyone to know how to do this, but it's remarkable. You can literally go to Google and type in Stu Phillips ResearchGate, and just you have a lifetime of research just there.
Yeah.
So, good stuff.
And how did you fall into lifting? It's common knowledge that at an earlier age you suffered from anorexia nervosa, and what drew you to lifting weights?
Well, my physician at the time more or less told me directly that if I had continued doing what I was doing, I would die, which I think was a helpful message. To, it had some informative content, and so that was a light bulb moment for me, and I realized that, wow, that like interesting. He describes the anorexia, and I can anorexia nervosa. Do you hear that? Do you hear that?
Yes. Hear what?
The echo.
No, not on my end.
Okay, we'll see. So I was going to say that I definitely hear an echo, a strong one.
There's nothing on my end.
Might you have headphones? Wait. Okay, it's gone.
It's good?
Never mind.
Oh, beautiful.
Aliens. So I was going to say that I first and foremost conceive of anorexia nervosa as a mental illness. And despite the disordered thinking that was involved in that for me, it was very, when that was said to me, I didn't bullshit my way out of it. I knew that it was the truth. So I knew that I needed to change the way I was doing things, and so I knew that I needed to gain weight. And one thought I had was, and there was definitely some disordered thinking still involved in this, but I knew enough to know that there is a real phenomenon of people becoming overweight after suffering from anorexia.
Yeah.
Because if someone's suffering from anorexia and very underweight, the immediate objective is to refeed them very aggressively, just get them back up to a healthy weight. And I don't want to say very often, but often enough that, again, it's a known phenomenon. People will rebound too much and they end up being genuinely overweight, and that was something that I, again, through a distorted lens, desired to avoid. So I had the thought of, okay, so I'll eat the food that I need to eat, and I'll also lift weights.
Okay.
Now that was mid 2007. I really got into lifting seriously early 2008, and since January 2008, I've never taken more than 2 weeks off of training.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear that led you to lifting weights. But do you draw, if any, parallels between anorexia nervosa and orthorexia nervosa in bodybuilding? And is there any true difference, between being obsessed with always getting bigger and then being obsessed with always getting smaller? I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So I would first note that I'm not a professional in the field of psychology, so I doubt anyone was under that misapprehension, but just for the record. So the interesting thing, a few thoughts about orthorexia. To my knowledge, this was a term created by one gentleman who runs a website that is incredibly non-specific. It's been a long time since I've looked at this, but I'm pretty confident it's not in the DSM. It's not recognized as an eating disorder, whereas anorexia is unquestionably one. So I think that his thesis is or was that we see enough commonalities in thinking and behavior to say, between what he calls orthorexia and anorexia, to say this is probably actually a mental illness or an eating disorder, similar to anorexia. And coming at it purely from the perspective of my own experience and talking to others about this and content I've seen online, there are definitely people who don't pathologically endeavor to get smaller or weigh less, but who clearly have disordered thinking relating to eating. So they might actually be physically very healthy weight, above average muscle mass, strong, good cardiovascular shape, etc. Whereas with someone who suffers from anorexia nervosa severely. I mean, it literally kills people.
Yeah.
Quite literally, their hearts fail. So they might not have those apparent physical symptoms, but they might be completely unwilling. I mean, completely unwilling to eat anything outside the scope of their usual, whatever it might be. It might be 2 meals a day. It might be 6. It might be the only vegetable they will eat is broccoli, etc. And if someone is inflexible to that degree, I think if I had to say, yes, that's either an eating disorder or not, I would say that it is. And it is very important to recognize that that's quite different from someone's in contest prep, and for 24 weeks, they've committed to, let's say, for 24 weeks, they're not going to travel. For 24 weeks, they're always going to train at the same gym because they want everything to be consistent. For 24 weeks, they're always going to wake up at the same time because they want their circadian rhythm to be consistent. For 24 weeks, they are actually always going to eat 5 meals a day because their best judgment is that's the best means of achieving ideal protein distribution. All of that and more, it could be 20 things like that. Someone could totally rationally commit to all of those things, and then immediately after the show, because they've been so committed and so rigid, and people around them have probably been negatively affected by that, immediately after the show, they have no problem going to IHOP and getting pancakes.
Yeah.
They're fine.
Yeah.
That's totally, like, even if the behavior looks super similar, the thinking behind it is radically different.
Yeah, for sure. And one of your biggest criticisms, I guess, when you first started, distributing content back in 08, was it? 08, 09?
Really 2011.
Yeah, when you first started putting content out, was that, you don't even, bro, like, you don't lift. Like, who are you to say that we should lift like this because, I'm bigger than you and all the rest of it. But from what I've seen over, the time frame that's lapsed is that you've made some pretty good gains. Some pretty impressive.
I appreciate you saying so.
You've made some pretty impressive gains. And what I'd like to ask you is, what was your starting weight when you first, day one, picked up weights, and now?
I think I was 104 pounds.
What's that, like 47 kilos?
Yeah, it's... Okay, so for one thing, this is many, many years ago now, so I'm probably misremembering, but I vividly remember that the lowest weight to which I got when I was anorexic was 44 kilos, because we were in France, so, hey, pretty much the whole world uses metric. So it was 44 kilos, which I think is 94 pounds, and so, a real shame I couldn't get below that, obviously. But yeah, 44 kilos, and then there was a period in which I refed. I mean, it was literally like 10 to 15,000 calories per day without lifting. I think I kind of settled about 10 pounds heavier than that. And I really don't know what this is in centimeters or meters, but I was 5'7" at the time, so not much shorter than I am now. And so I think I started lifting consistently. Yeah, so I was about 104, and then I did like lifting at home, stuff like this, for about 6 months. And then by the time I really started actually going to the gym almost every day kind of thing, I was I think 117 pounds, and then now I'm 173 or something. So there's,
that's phenomenal.
Small difference between that. Is that what you were thinking, like right from the beginning, or when I was putting out content initially?
No, from start to now. Yeah, that's
sure.
So 70 pounds is around 30 kilos?
Not a math major.
Yeah, me neither.
I'm so not good at math in my head like that. But something I want to note, because I don't want it to not be addressed, is I do think a lot of that weight would have been gained just as a function of going from being 14 to 23. Let's say I hadn't lifted at all in that period. I think a lot of that weight would have been gained. So I'm not going to claim that right now I would be 117 or 104 pounds if not for lifting. But I do think that it's not tenable to say that this is all just natural growth.
Yeah, for sure. And something that happens with most, I guess, figures in the fitness industry, experts, authorities, whatever you want to call them, is that there's a certain level of expectation and pressure placed on, us as leaders in the fitness industry to look a certain way, produce content, always be doing, the right things, and so forth. Have you experienced in your time in the fitness industry, that pressure became too much and you felt burnt out?
Yeah, definitely. Early 2015.
Yeah.
I put out a video about exercise selection, talking about why I believe that some really popular exercises like bench press, I think deadlifts were overrated, and suggestions that I would make instead. And that just created overwhelming drama. I mean, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of critical comments. And something that's true of me, whether this is good or bad, it's just how I am, is I'm not someone who can see all that and say, who gives a shit?
Yeah.
Just totally ignore it. Like that, just out of principle, I feel like if I were to say to you, yeah, I think everyone has to train every body part at least 3 days a week, and you were to say, well, I disagree, I don't feel like just be like, that's nice, bro. Next topic, right? And so it was hugely stressful at the time, and that was the straw that broke the camel's back, in the sense that had happened many times prior. And I had this moment of recognition that I was deeply unhappy with the way things were playing out. So I completely stopped YouTube at that point, took almost all my videos down, and I don't recall exactly what I was thinking, but I might have been intent on just not even coming back at all. And then I guess almost exactly a year later, starting probably 6 months later, I started feeling a pull of, what am I doing? This is what I've done traditionally. I'm really, like, to use the phrase I used earlier, I'm leaving, I could be doing something with this that would be beneficial to people, and I'm not doing it because I found the result of it very unpleasant in the past. And so, again, I started feeling that probably about 6 months later, and then about a year later, in creating Lifting for Life LLC, I was just like, okay, I got to do this. Put a new video up. Response was overwhelmingly positive. And then, put things up kind of inconsistently throughout last year, and I'm getting better about it.
Yeah. And what are some things that you've, I guess, adopted to make sure that doesn't happen again? Like, how have you changed your perception of your role in the industry to ensure that you don't feel that pressure?
Well, to give a very specific example, and your question can be answered more broadly, but I think this is a good example. I am more or less completely unwilling to put anyone's name other than mine or someone I'm interviewing in the title of a video. Because even if the video is absolutely jam-packed with the most incredible informative content, and I'm not, by the way, saying that that's true of my content, but I'm saying even if it were the best video ever made on YouTube, but it's in response to someone else, the immediate visceral response is clickbait, trying to get attention. And I'm sure many, if not most, if not everyone watching/listening to this knows of people who more or less just do this, honestly. Yeah. And I'm very averse to that. And I recognize it's what I did in the past, but at this point I've actually had people ask me directly, like, will you make a video about this thing that this person said? And even if that thing that that person said is total nonsense, it's like, I might talk about the topic, but I'm not going to make a video with their name in it. Additionally, I think my general general approach is much more nuanced now. So instead of making a video saying exercise selection mistakes, this is why I think you shouldn't do deadlifts, I might say, this is why I generally recommend Romanian deadlifts instead of conventional deadlifts in hypertrophy training. So it's less, really, I think
more
people
positive.
are simply less likely to disagree with it because the claims are more modest.
Yeah.
So that's why with someone like Eric Helms, there's practically no drama. Because Eric doesn't come out and say this is shit. He says, based on my reading of the literature, I'd say, that's one option, but this is probably, etc.
Yeah.
So, like, who would see anything he says and think, no, this is obviously nonsense.
Yeah, that's bashing.
So, yeah.
And you mentioned Romanian deadlifts versus deadlifts for hypertrophy. And we know that the primary driver of hypertrophy is, total training volume. What are your interpretations of the literature for, devising a hypertrophy program? I'd like to pick your brain a little bit about that as we get into some bodybuilding related discussion.
Absolutely. I think, first of all, there's a question of what it is we mean by volume. Off the top of my head, I know of volume load, which does seem to be the standard in the literature, which is just sets, reps, load. My sense is that that's used because it's perhaps the simplest means of designing studies. I know that a similar but arguably refined version of that is sets, reps, load, percentage, 1 rep max. To my knowledge, that was proposed by Mike Zordos. I'm not sure if it's actually in any of the literature yet, but I know that the concept's out there. There's also set volume, which is number of working sets. And also number of reps is an approach taken. I think Eric Helms, I'm not sure if the approach, I would say often uses that. Like for hypertrophy programs, I've seen him say things like, I think it's 40 to 70 reps per workout.
Yeah.
Gosh, it's been a really long time.
Yeah, no, that's correct. That's in the
one
pyramids
approach as well.
Yeah.
So I think for hypertrophy training, given it's more or less uncontroversial that most of what you do should be, Eric just said it to me last night, RPE 6 to 9, 8 to 12 reps. So like moderately high RPEs, moderately heavy load. A set is more or less a set. So I think a number of working sets is generally the best metric. So in designing a program generally, you really want to start with what is it the person's trying to accomplish, how many days a week can they train, and for how long. Those things are huge and not talked about, probably because they're so important they're unstated.
Yeah.
And then beyond that, I look to frequency, generally favoring higher frequencies. I think 2 times a week frequency is basically the minimum, unless there's something that you're really deliberately trying to deprioritize, or perhaps someone has a really low work and or recovery capacity. So that might be appropriate. And then scale up from there. So I do a lot of 3 times per week, so six training days, lower uppers. I think that can be a really good option for folks who maybe won't be able to tolerate frequent full bodies, but it gives them 50% more frequency than a typical lower upper. You definitely want to look at volume in terms of you have to look at it a number of different ways. Total volume meaning everything the person is doing in a week. Can they tolerate it? Can they recover from it? Can they improve upon it? Also on a body part basis and over a week, but even more so workout by workout. So something I think about a lot, when designing programs and talking about programming is number of working sets per body part per workout.
Yeah.
And then a way to modulate total volume is frequency. So instead of, and obviously there are going to be exceptions to this, but as a general principle, instead of scaling volume up and down in one workout, I would scale volume up and down with frequency. Because you're able to then maintain volume quality in each session.
Yeah. And you've spoken about, people's ability to adhere to a program, volume, frequency, intensity, and, RPEs and so forth. But coming back to what we said about exercise selection, and a conventional deadlift versus a Romanian deadlift, I see, in my experience, I'm sure you see the same thing, people mistake the fact that, oh, hey, I can deadlift, say 180 kilos for 10 reps. That's more volume, but I can only Romanian deadlift 100 kilos for the same amount of reps. That's less volume. Therefore, conventional deadlift, more volume, means I'm going to get bigger. Can you elaborate on why a Romanian deadlift, just as one example, is a better exercise for a hypertrophy program than a conventional deadlift?
Sure. So I think, for one thing, it's easier to get someone to really emphasize hinging at the hip. Because what you can do with an RDL is you can have someone unrack, and then you can instruct them. The very first thing you do is you drive your hips back. I'm looking over here as if there's someone here. Very first thing you do.
Coaching from the side.
Right. Drive your hips back, and then feel a stretch in your hamstrings, initiate the ascent, and then hip thrust. So just from the cueing perspective, really, I found that it's superior. I think with deadlifts, it's just, and I don't want to assume everyone is, the low intermediate guy at the gym who's been training for 2 years, probably with a bro split and does a lot wrong. But it really seems that with deadlifts, people default to like heavy round back deadlifts, and I look at them and their glutes are clearly almost totally inactive. And I find that absolutely you can take a conventional deadlift and address those issues, or you could have them do an RDL and build it perfectly from scratch.
So is ease of execution the primary thing you're looking at here?
Yeah, that's huge. And additionally, I think you're able to get more of a stretch in your hamstrings. You're not deloading between reps. And this gets highly technical really quickly, but to my understanding, and the person to bring on relating to this would be Andrew Ligotsky. Yeah. And this is to do with motor unit recruitment in the case of heavy load versus light load training. You can generate full motor unit recruitment with light training, but the issue seems to be that of whether or not you are activating all motor units concurrently, like at the same time. And I don't want to make an overly strong claim here, but I'm concerned that in the case of hypertrophy training, in deloading, you might decrease motor unit recruitment in that you are activating the same motor units over and over as opposed to not deloading, fatiguing them more, which would then involve motor units which would not be involved initially. Now, one could get around this by simply using a heavy load from the get-go, but that's a reason why I'm hesitant to include exercises where you deload between reps. I think that's it.
Yeah, and what are some other considerations, that you take into account when selecting exercises for a hypertrophy program?
Sure, I think it's an interesting question because I've been thinking and talking a lot about this recently, and in some sense it's really simple. It's like, what is the function of the targeted muscle? Does this exercise correspond with this? And does it allow you to use, first and foremost, is it, I guess I would say, a range of motion, meaning like if it's not isometric, it's already an improvement. But a significant, if you have two exercises and one has a significantly greater range of motion than the other, I think that's advantageous. I do look at things like tension curves. If I wouldn't say that I think too much into that, but if there were a scenario where the tension curve is just clearly really bad, and nothing actually comes to mind at the moment, but perhaps if you had an exercise where, it works the targeted muscle through a full range of motion, but through most of the range of motion, it's not even loaded or something.
Yeah.
That would be an issue. A lot of it has to do with personal preference. How well do you tolerate it? As an example, I find it with barbell presses, and I'm not a strong person and I don't go heavier than I'm able to do, but barbell presses trash my elbows.
Yeah.
Like I'll do them, I get in the groove of them a bit. When I start progressing, it really quickly, just my elbows are done. Whereas with dumbbells, I don't have that issue. And so even if you could generate 5 fantastic theoretical arguments for a barbell press being superior, it doesn't matter if they're excruciatingly painful. So yeah, I think if you look at exercises regarded as good exercises for any given body part, why are squats good for the quads? Well, you're obviously performing a ton of loaded knee flexion and knee extension. You don't have some clearly disadvantageous tension curve. You are able to load the exercise safely. You're able to add load more. It isn't as if it's impossible to go above 135 pounds on a squat, and so on.
Yeah.
It's safe within appropriate rep ranges, etc. And then you would apply that same reasoning against any other exercise for any other body part.
Yeah, sure. And you mentioned, how you get elbow pain with barbell pressing, and obviously you have very good self-awareness and prioritize your health. And you've mentioned before that bodybuilders often fail to prioritize their health in pursuit of gains. What implications do you see for those who miss this in the bustle?
Well, interestingly, the first thing I would note is if someone is aware of this and they literally don't care, then perhaps it's rational for them to behave in that manner. In other words, to take, I was going to say an extreme example, but this happens all the time in pro bodybuilding. Guys who are, whatever drugs they use and whatever quantity they use that are risking their health. I don't think they don't know. They just want to be the best. They want to become an IPE pro. They want to get third at the Olympia. They want to win, etc. So if they approach the issue very rationally, then I'm not sure I would object to that. Those just aren't my values. But I wouldn't say, well, that's not the way I approach things, so you're an idiot. On the other hand, I wonder how many people aren't really aware of this. In other words, I wonder how many people, if something health-related were to come up, their response wouldn't be, oh, well, I know that I've been risking my health, so this is not unexpected. I wonder how many people would respond by saying, oh, I didn't realize, how bad this was. So here's an example, which I think is a real one, at least to some significant extent, of very reductionist IFYM people who just clearly eat large amounts of unhealthy food. And I don't find that a problematic term, by the way. And seem to be under the impression that, really the main thing is hit your macros. I think that's, again, if that person doesn't care about their health, then they're just like, I hit my macros and I look good and I lose fat, I gain muscle, whatever the objective is, okay. But I wonder how many people are like, yeah, this is totally fine. They have no concept of, what their diet really consists of beyond, I know these 3 numbers.
Yeah.
They might be very, this is very often true. In fact, I saw a medical student say online that in practice he has never seen someone not be vitamin D3 deficient or vitamin D deficient. Like every single time he's seen a chart, that's been true. So that would be an example of, I wonder how many people always hit their macros and take a cheap multi and they lift 5 days a week for an hour and a half and they think they have all their bases covered. And again, that isn't the person who knows that they don't have their bases covered, but they don't care because it's worth it for them. Rather, this is the person who just doesn't know.
Yeah.
And I think that's unfortunate. And I think these can all be balanced. I don't think it's either you look amazing and you're unhealthy, or you look terrible and you're healthy kind of thing. I think with fairly modest effort, one can address some of these other concerns that are not related to maximizing muscle mass and decreasing body fat.
Yeah, sure. And, to talk quickly about some, nutrition protocols that you've used in the past and so forth. When it comes to bulking and gaining lean body mass, what is your personal preference, and what do you think to be the best way to approach that in terms of the size of the calorie surplus?
Sure. So, a number of thoughts on this. One is, interestingly, I practically never try to calculate energy surpluses or deficits, because in practice what I found is I go directly to what I feel is more significant in practice, which is macros. So a lot of it has to do with intuition. Intuitively, I know this is the change that needs to happen to generate this outcome. And I've gotten to the point where it's actually very rare that it doesn't pan out in the way I expect.
And this is for you personally, just to clarify?
So this is for me personally, and as a coach. So I realize that's problematic when someone asks me, let's say they're eating 3,000 calories a day and they're maintaining weight, and they need to know what they should be eating. I'm like, I actually don't really know. But with regard to bulking generally, I diverge on this, and it might almost sound like a contradiction, but I think for some people, short-term, fairly aggressive bulking, and I say fairly aggressive because aggressive might mean 6 pounds a month. Like, there are people go all in, eat everything you can see, and that's like 20 pounds in 2 months.
Yeah. So
that's not what I'm suggesting, but for some people, I think shorter bulks, more aggressive and focused are the way to go. Okay. And that really speaks to the significance of psychology and knowing how someone ticks. And that's, had you asked me this question even a year ago, I probably wouldn't have said anything about this. But in my own experience, in the past, I did much, much longer bulks. And in hindsight, I'm able to recognize that at some point they got very unfocused. And I was just, I was lifting and I was eating, but I was a fat guy who training, nothing was really happening in terms of progress.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And something that I've done differently this year, and this current bulk that I'm doing right now is the one I can think of where I've stayed almost as lean as I was at the end of my cut last year, is I've been very focused about it. I've really tried to treat it, and this is hard because you're going to have days where you're just extremely tired and you're not going to have good workouts and so on, but I've tried to think of it as really like a contest prep. Like, every day matters. Every workout matters. Because, and this isn't just true of me, I've discussed this with other coaches in the past, and there is this real phenomenon of people thinking, well, I'm bulking, I'm in a surplus, the surplus is going to do the work, so whatever. And so
training takes a back seat.
Those people will start cutting, and they suddenly start training much more intently. If nothing else, they're more focused.
Yeah.
So that speaks to making a case for shorter bulks, more aggressive. Meanwhile, if you have the person who, you could give them a protocol today and say, please run this protocol until 2034, they'd be like, okay, sounds good. So that wouldn't be someone, and not only do they say, okay, that sounds good, but they go off and they do it, and it's no issue. And I wouldn't think of that person as being someone for whom you'd say, yeah, you should bulk for 12 weeks pretty aggressively and then maybe do a mini cut. Rather, that might be someone who you say, okay, you competed last year, you're back to a healthy body fat percentage now, you're you're more or less able to do whatever you want. Okay, you should slow bulk for 5 years. You should, very slow bulk for 5 years, gain 7.2 pounds of stage weight, diet down. And they're going to be like, sounds fantastic. And so in that context, that would be the way to go. And so the question becomes, what's appropriate in any given scenario, and
intrinsic motivation and stuff.
I do wonder which is the better recommendation generally, because in the past I definitely would have said slow, very lean bulk, but at this point I'm more skeptical of that.
Yeah.
And interestingly, by the way, I noticed on Facebook recently, Mike Israetel, I think, is known as being someone who advocates for more aggressive bulks, and I would say, for the sake of charity, I did see a comment of his where he said that he's updated his views on this, so I think he's more conservative than he used to be. But he even said something like he isn't sure which approach would pan out better, I think, in terms of muscle gain in the long haul. And I think that's a very reasonable perspective. I would say that if I had to bet, the protocol which will work the best will be the one that the person is most involved in and that they direct the most energy toward. And if we assume that variable is the same, then I think those two approaches would pan out about the same way.
Yeah, that's
in the long run.
Extremely interesting. And something I've noticed that you've been paying particular attention to of late is leucine. And you've mentioned that the literature suggests there's a maximum, not a minimum threshold by which muscle protein synthesis is increased. Can you elaborate on that and just give us your views on, what you think the evidence suggests to be optimal as it stands?
Yes, definitely. So, a common perspective in the fitness industry, I'm not sure I would say the evidence-based, I don't want to imply that everyone in the evidence-based community is misinformed or something like this, but most people are now aware of leucine and the fact that leucine initiates muscle protein synthesis, which is just to say that it starts it. It's not enough to have a prolonged anabolic response. But very often it's said that the leucine threshold is a minimum amount of leucine one needs to consume to initiate muscle protein synthesis. And that's completely wrong. Because that suggests, let's really stop and think about what that would mean in practice. That would mean if the leucine threshold is 3 grams, you ingest 2.94 grams, and that has no effect on muscle protein synthesis. And that simply isn't the case. There is such a thing as a leucine threshold, but what it is a maximum threshold above which ingesting more leucine has no additional effect on muscle protein synthesis. So once again, if we assume the leucine threshold is 3 grams, and there are problems with that, by the way, that I'll come back to, but if it just is 3 grams, that means that they want to be hitting the leucine threshold. I mean, if we want to take it to the extreme of what is theoretically absolutely optimal, I would say hitting the leucine threshold, probably 5 meals a day.
Yeah. Based
on my reading of the literature, that's the number I continuously gravitate toward. However, that also means that if for some reason you train and eat 5 grams of protein after a workout, that doesn't do nothing. I would not advise that, but it doesn't do nothing. And indeed, there was a study, I think this was the study that started all of this research, really looking at the influence of different doses of protein and types of protein, etc., ingested after training. And in this study, this came out of Stu Phillips' group in 2009, 5 grams of whole egg protein ingested post-workout significantly increased muscle protein synthesis relative to a placebo. I think it was a 37% difference. So if you train and then eat nothing, muscle protein synthesis is elevated by the training.
Yeah, sure.
But if you train and then have 5 grams of protein, that's a 37% greater effect. And in bodybuilding terms, 5 grams of protein is like What do you mean, bro?
Yeah.
Whereas 20 grams of protein yields 2.5 times the effect of that.
Okay.
So again, if you want to maximize your progress, yes, hit the leucine threshold. But the very simple practical implication is don't fear that if you have 8 or 12 or 18 grams of protein in a meal for whatever reason, that protein simply isn't going to do anything or is simply going to get oxidized, because the evidence doesn't indicate that's the case. So I think it's a matter of, yes, there are things you have to do if you want to maximize your progress, but I don't want, lay people who are just trying to make decent progress and who have many other things they're worrying about to freak out if they're hitting 17 grams of protein instead of 20 or something like this. And one last thing that I wanted to mention about the leucine threshold, because I alluded to it earlier, is from my understanding, it's technically conceived of as being on being reflective of body weight, 0.045 grams per kilogram of body weight.
Yep.
Now, Tipton et al. 2016, which compared 20 grams of protein to 40 grams of protein after a full body session, found that bigger and smaller guys, I don't recall the specifics, but significant differences in body weight, there weren't differences in resulting muscle protein synthesis. Now, that is one study, but it's a high-quality study, and it's suggestive of protein needs not scaling in the way we would expect with body weight, at least in terms of that one metric of acute muscle protein synthesis after training.
Okay, yeah, that's very good to know for those people who aren't able to get 30 grams of protein immediately after their session. It can put them at ease quite a lot. And something that you've been discussing of late is intuitive eating. And you've mentioned that some structure, especially for you, is more beneficial. But can we truly eat intuitively, Ian, considering our environment, poor satiety signaling, culture, and, our biological drive to consume?
Fantastic question. I was just talking to someone about this, I think, last night, and I said, I think I've grown to really dislike the term intuitive eating.
Likewise.
Because what we call intuitive eating, if it works well in practice, is actually appropriately structured eating with intuitive elements.
Yeah, less rigid.
Right. So let's reiterate that, because it's really important. It's like successful intuitive eating has rules.
Yeah.
It isn't get up, today I want eggs with 6 donuts. And I realize that's a deliberately ridiculous scenario, but I am reminded of Dorian Yates saying that, because he's known as being very rigid with his training. Like I'm, to my knowledge, for the duration of his reign as Mr. Olympia, his workouts were practically identical for 6 or 7 consecutive years. Like the same workouts, the same exercises.
Right.
I think he only trained things, or changed things rather, when he got injured. And he was asked at some point, I think it was in a seminar, about intuitive training, going by feel, basically. And he said, well, if I went by feel, I would go home and drink a beer. I mean, seriously.
Yeah,
like
that's true.
Like, so in terms of food, from an evolutionary perspective, that which is intuitive would be eating tons of high carb, high fat, very energy dense food, because it's conducive to fat gain, which will decrease your likelihood of death in case of famine.
Yeah.
So yes, and this isn't just you, by the way, or me, saying this. I've had people tell me the same thing of when they get really intuitive of, for this meal, I want chicken and rice at this meal, but later I want pizza. And then the next day, like, there's this new restaurant around the corner. It sounds really good. In other words, the closer one gets to the way everyone who doesn't care about fitness eats, the worse their outcome.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's interesting I'm going to use this word here, but that's highly intuitive, right? If you basically just eat like some guy off the street, then your results will be closer to that. Now, I think one might respond to this by saying, well, yeah, that's obvious, but that's not really what people mean by intuitive eating. Well, that's really my point, is if what we mean by intuitive eating is as simple as you don't track your macros, but you pretty much eat the way you do it if you were to track your macros, and one day you eat pasta, one day you eat rice, and you vary portions a little bit based on how hungry you are, I think that can work extremely well. But I would note that honestly, what I've just described, of all of the dietary approaches out there, that sounds closest to traditional clean eating, where people are quite consistent, typically weigh their food, but don't track. Like that actually sounds very similar to what I've just described as being intuitive eating. So in wanting to turn this discussion in the direction of what can people do, what's valuable, what's actionable, I would say I made a video entitled How to Stick to Your Diet, and a 16-minute video in which I said, essentially, experiment, try different things, but not in a
free-for-all.
Yeah, not in a non-committal way. What you need to do is come up with an idea which you think is good in principle and implement it and really commit to it and implement it for, at the very least a week. And I only say a week because some people really struggle with sticking to almost anything. See how it pans out. Be as analytical as you can in collecting data, body weight, how do you look, how do you feel, etc. And then reevaluate. And if it was clearly fantastic, continue, make adjustments, etc. So for the people who are going to be successful with intuitive eating, again, I think it's going to have many elements that you would see in clean eating, elements that you would see in the person who's tracking every single day. For a few quick examples, eating around the same time each day, I think that's advantageous. I think to my knowledge, there's actually some evidence indicating that that's beneficial toward health outcomes, although that's far outside the scope of what I have good knowledge of. I think hunger, to a large extent, correlates with one's circadian rhythm. And this is something I've been, this year I've been way more rigid than in the past. And that's something I've noticed is when I get in a rhythm, like let's say that I miss a meal, it gets pushed back, so I eat it later. Even if I've just eaten, I actually get hungry later because that's when I usually eat that next meal. So that would be an example of something that would be beneficial when it comes to intuitive eating around the same time, having multiple meals per day, which are the same from day to day. So you don't have to think about it. That's time and energy that you don't have to exert to figure out what you're eating. So avoidance of decision fatigue, which is quite literally the fatigue which results from making decisions, is immense. Because I can definitely, this most often, this is such a, just speaking for myself, people might find this very mildly amusing. One of the best indicators for me of whether or not I'm tired, like not, I'm a bit tired, but like really tired, is if I struggle to make almost any minor decision. And I do think I am sure there are people out there who eat different foods every day and track everything and always hit their macros and they're super happy. But if I had to bet, I would bet that is a minuscule minority of folks. Whereas, again, the person who's successful with a clean, like a very conservative, traditional clean eating approach, and the person who's successful with IFYM, and the person who's successful with intuitive eating, there are going to be similarities there in terms of their meal frequency is going to be like the meal frequency that works for them. It's going to be quite consistent. They're going to have a pretty narrow set of foods that they enjoy and that hit their macros or are nutritionally appropriate. And then a very specific recommendation I often give people is keep all of your meals the same each day, with the exception of one, typically your last meal. So someone will have the day of school and or work and all of the things that go into that, and they'll train And through that period, they just have to execute.
Yeah.
This is what I eat, da-da-da-da-da. And then at the end of the day, I don't mean so late that they're falling asleep, but I mean in the last 2 hours of the day, roughly, they'll be able to sit down and evaluate and say, okay, this is where I am relative to where I want to be. This is also what I want to eat. This is what works.
Yep, saving up some calories for the end of the day.
Yeah, that's another component of it as well. And that is the, in terms of one approach, which I found to work well for many different people, that would be the approach.
Yeah, for sure. And as we draw to the end of this podcast, in your career, you've mentioned that one of the primary motivations for you was contempt, ignorance, dishonesty, especially when it came to misinformation. We've mentioned that you've matured and all the rest of it, but
Sure.
Has your motivation changed over time, and what is it now, Ian?
Oh, definitely. So I would first acknowledge that I am contemptuous of misinformation, and I think...
Oh, no way. Are you really?
Right, like, huge surprise. Strong, inadvertent imitation of your accent, by the way. I apologize for that.
That's all right.
That was really bizarre. So I would still grant that when I see misinformation, it is bothersome to me. There isn't an emotional response. It's more, I guess, disappointment. Is that an emotion? But what still really actually gets under my skin is when I perceive people as being dishonest. That's still something that really, because I think that's deeper than just you're wrong, you know? Because I see people who every day, just even if I scroll Facebook for 2 minutes, I will see a piece of content that I perceive as inaccurate. But if my feeling is that the person is very sincere, it's like, maybe I'll comment on it. Maybe I'll message to that person and say, hey, here's another perspective.
Yeah,
here's a way to think about this. And very often people will be like, oh, wow, I really appreciate you saying this. And so I wouldn't say I have contempt toward that. Someone made an honest mistake. I think much more problematic is folks who are dishonest, who interact with the evidence inappropriately, who misrepresent it, who make false claims, and I think they know better. But at the same time, it really does, addressing that directly, explicitly, naming names publicly, does generate such discord. So my primary focus, so that's all just kind of clearing my throat of acknowledging that's still a thing. But first and foremost, it's what can I do to help people? So very often I will see something and I'm like, I'll start getting irritated and I'll catch myself and be like, I know for a fact that I have 18 message requests on Instagram. So I could read this and be contemptuous of it and get marginally upset. I could write a post about it, or I could say, all right, that's always going to be there, because it is always going to be there, which is, it can be disheartening, the sense of think of all of what we've done, and then you still see, Gary Taubes going on Joe Rogan's podcast and
I saw that.
Calling Birmingham a little red brick town. That was interesting. But, that's always going to be there.
You couldn't even remember Aragon's claims at the fitness summit a few years back.
That was quite...
concerning.
That was really a strange interaction in my submission. But really, I endeavor very much to ignore stuff like that now, I realize. Indeed, sometimes people will send things that they'll be like, look at this bullshit that this person said. And I'm kind of hesitant because it's like, that's always going to be there. There are always going to be 1,000 pieces of terrible content, relative to every piece of really good content put out by, the gentleman I've mentioned. So we could view it from the perspective of, we're perpetually losing, but rather I try to view it from the perspective of, to get really fundamental here. As long as I'm alive and don't have Alzheimer's and have access to the internet, I'm able to go online and read a study and write 4 sentences about it and post about it, and maybe 3 people would have never seen it otherwise, and they see it and they benefit from it in some way, and I'd say that's worth doing.
Yeah, for sure.
So,
And Ian,
that would be motivation.
Yeah, that's very impressive to see where you've come from and where you are now. It's very motivating. And how do you, on a personal level, continue to improve your wealth of knowledge? Because it's very easy to get to a point and think, oh well, I know so much, that can have only this much effect in changing or improving my training or nutrition protocols. Any further investment in time isn't going to yield a greater benefit to a significant degree that it would be worth spending all that time researching and whatnot. How do you continually stay motivated to learn more, read more, and continue to do what you do?
Sure, I think there are a number of things that go into it. One would be that, funnily enough, the word fraud comes to mind. People will tell me, and I guess it would be accurate to say that you've said this, some people in the world regard me as knowing what I'm talking about. Well, I have to back that up. I can't just be the guy that people think knows what he's talking about. Like, I actually need to pay attention to what the literature says for that to be a genuine. I would feel really weird if my perception was people are telling me I'm great and I actually know. I don't read any studies. And so that's part of it. Another part of it is just very genuine curiosity of enjoying. Like, I am addictive toward reading. I genuinely display addictive behavior when it comes to reading. I mean, one of the things that really messed up my sleep schedule from early on in life is I would start a book and I would read until 4 o'clock in the morning as a pretty young child that needs to get up at 6 or whatever for school, because I literally, on a rational level, I would be like, I need to stop this because I need to sleep, but it's too interesting. So part of it is like compulsive of just, it's so fascinating to me, assuming the topic interests me. There's also an edge of realizing how little I know relative to some of the people I look up to, and then even, and this is no criticism of them, but think of I'm obviously having a discussion with you, but additionally everyone watching or listening to this probably has the person who they most look up to in the industry. Like, think of how much they know, and it's like very little relative to everything there is to know, even within the scope of one field.
The Dunning-Kruger effect, right?
So just to be pedantic for a second, the Dunning-Kruger effect is a form of cognitive bias where it's really fascinating. Someone lacks the cognitive faculties necessary to recognize their lack of cognitive faculties. So I do think that's very often problematic, but again, it's putting in perspective, being a genuine expert. Like, using the example of a PhD, something that people who actually have PhDs will tell you is, assuming that they're appropriately honest about what it means, they'll say, yeah, they might be an incredible expert in that little sliver of that field that they specialized in. So again, feeling like I don't want to let people down, just being really interested in some of these topics and wanting to read about them, and also not letting myself think what you described of, hey, I'm smart and I don't need to do anything. It's a real danger, by the way. I don't want to make it sound like life is super hard being intelligent, but I think everyone has their own, whatever it might be. Like, if you're incredibly tall, that gives you an advantage for playing basketball, but it's terrible getting on a plane. And so definitely if one is reasonably intelligent, a risk of that can be, hey, I'm intelligent, I don't need to know anything. I'm just like, like, I deserve to be on this podcast. Like, I'm just so smart. Like, there's a real, and every single person watching this has met someone like that. I mean, that's who I was 5 years ago. I'm so fucking smart. I just I deserve it. And that's really problematic. That's a really problematic attitude. So
your answers here have almost fed into my next and final question, Ian. I couldn't have scripted this any better.
Sure.
Is knowing too much potentially harmful, and can overthinking lead to indecision when it comes to getting the job done?
I'm loving these questions. But I fed him these questions, everyone.
Yeah, we pre-scripted this.
Right.
Ian, what did you want me to ask you today?
Right, exactly. Yeah, definitely is the short answer. And this has been true of me in the past. I mean, let's create let's say that there's some situation in life, whatever it is, and all you have to decide is if you're going to do this or that. You have two options. Now, let's say that you're in that situation and you know very little about it, and just your gut tells you that you should go this way, it's better. All right, so you're going to go that way. Meanwhile, the person, let's say someone is an expert in whatever this decision is, like the expert of experts, they just know everything. They'll just sit there, they might sit there options for like 45 minutes, like panicking of like, well, I can give 16 lines of evidence for why I should do this. I can give 14 lines of evidence over here, but these arguments are more weighty, and yeah, I definitely think that can happen. So, and this has definitely happened to me, so it's something I really endeavor to do, and it's up to each person watching this and looking at my material to evaluate, use their own best judgment and let me know. I'm genuinely curious whether, how people think I'm doing on this. But as an example, when I write posts about studies, something I would have done in the past is I would just read a study. I would, on a very theoretical level, I would find it interesting. Out of principle, this is interesting. And I would just read it, and this is what it says. Now, something I try to do, I don't always do it. I don't always remember to do it. I don't always succeed in doing it. But I will say, as an example, we talked about the Leucine Threshold. In the past, I might have said, yeah, this is what the Leucine Threshold is. Next question. Whereas now, I at least endeavor to say, okay, this is what the Leucine Threshold is. And this is what that means for you in practice.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed that.
This is how you can take this tidbit of scientific information that you might not, really care that much about, which, by the way, to each their own. If someone doesn't care, they don't care. It's fine, as long as they don't pretend to care. But here's the practical conclusion for that. So yes, again, is the answer. I think it can be paralyzing to some extent to know a lot about something. And so I don't think the solution is to know less or to stop paying attention. I think that would be problematic because you would know less.
Yeah.
But I think that needs to be combined with an ability to make quick decisions and to look at all of that evidence and just say, really intuitively, given your experience, given your, everything that's happened, just what is your immediate sense of this is what you got to do.
Yeah. So,
and that's something I've been really focused on for probably about a year, and it's been really beneficial to me because there are even, to give a simple example, there were times in the past where I would be at the gym and I would need to decide what to do next, and it would be a project of I say that, it would, 3 minutes or something. I'm not saying hours would be spent on this, but, should I do this or that? And this has a different tension curve, and this feels a little different on my elbow. And whereas now it's really what does my gut tell me? And fortunately, I have enough experience and knowledge that that's usually correct. For the person who doesn't have that, probably more helpful a suggestion would be to learn more, but to also always endeavor to frame that in terms of what can I do with this in practice. Maybe the answer is nothing and you just find it interesting, and that's fine. But what you don't want to do is read a protein dose study today change what you do tomorrow. Tomorrow, read a different study out of a different lab, and they make a slightly different suggestion. So you change what you do. Like, again, you have to take a step back and put everything in the greater context and try to make decisions on that basis.
Yeah, thank you for answering that. It's something I've been wanting to ask you for quite a long time. And it was,
Absolutely.
Perfect response. Well, Ian, thank you very much for joining us on the podcast. We really appreciate your time, as well as sharing your experiences, knowledge, and everything else in between. So on behalf of myself and JPS, thank you, and we'll speak to you next time.
My pleasure, Jacob. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Ian.